again. This is our podcast, QueeNation, and we're your hosts, Callie and Tanya. And we're really happy to have you back. First of all, we'd like to thank you for staying with us during our last 2 episodes, and we hope that you'll enjoy this one as well. As you remember, in our last episode, we were leading you through the latest updates in the work of LGBT community in Ukraine and what kind of actions they took to make the Pride months of 2020 special. Moreover, we talked about how American and British embassies showed their solidarity for the LGBT movement in Russia and how the first digital Pride was organized there. This episode will be the last one in our series, and today we'll be shedding some light on the role of the church in Russian and Ukrainian society and how it influences the perception of homosexuality and the LGBT movements in both countries. Let's get into it.
Mass church organizations in Ukraine constantly demonstrate a very strong and consistently negative attitude towards all issues related to homosexuality. That is why in Ukrainian society the church has indeed become the main source of homophobia, and this topic is one of the few on which representatives of all major confessions as well as new church public associations have a common opinion. And Volodymyr explains what opinion that is.
Traditionally, that destroys the family. They also, for some reason, combine gender and homosexuality, although these are very different things.
These beliefs are even stronger in the west of Ukraine, where the church shows a more significant influence. In this way, they constantly insist that a married couple can only be considered as a union between a man and a woman, and that in no case they agree to accept other options. At the same time, our activist from Lviv, Volodymyr, repeatedly spoke about the fact that the Catholic Church is changing just in small steps.
The apostolic churches need to change a lot in the councils. Changes in these churches occur not for years, but for decades. But the presence of Pope Francis, his public position already indicates that the Catholic Church is changing. So yes, there's an ambivalence, but I personally remain optimistic about the Church.
Unfortunately, homophobic ideas cultivated by the Ukrainian ministers of the Church find fertile ground not only in the minds of their ordinary parishioners, but also reflected in the words and actions of government officials and politicians of various ranks. And Boris comments on this.
I do not understand how in a modern secular state the church can have such an influence. Especially, I may just be wrong somewhere because this is not my specificity, but the Council of Churches, which has an extremely large influence on both legislative activity in Ukraine and politics in general, and also the representatives of the churches are, for example, in an anti-discrimination commission at the Ministry of Education and Science. That is, for me, this dominance of the church looks bad and unacceptable.
But Timur Levchuk says that everything is not so easy when we talk about the relationships of politicians with the church, because most likely they do not support their views, but rather feel threatened by the God institution.
Well, it's hard with the church. That is, it always threatens politicians. It threatens local politicians. That if, God forbid, you do something, we will immediately anathemize you. We lead people. This is such a sneaky blackmail, and they are hard to ignore because they tend to manipulate numbers. They narrate that almost the entire population of Ukraine is a super mega believer who goes to church every day. But it's not quite like this. They are hard to ignore. It seems to me that they are hiding behind the fact that they represent the majority, and because of this, politicians do not want to quarrel with them, because they want to win the election sooner or later.
In addition, many activists claim that there is an international anti-LGBT network which has links in Ukraine and in Russia. In particular, they spoke about the World Congress of Families, an American organization that constantly maintains ties with conservative politicians. Timur adds,
and on top of it, we still have a big pro-family movement. But in fact, this movement neither belongs to the Russian Orthodox Church, nor to the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, nor to the Greek Catholics. I don't remember what it's called. These are various Protestant groups, and in general I would probably add that they are usually funded by conservative circles in the States. Well, that is, the States can fund more than just LGBT actually. There are conservative circles that finance conservative movements in different countries in the same way.
We talked on the same topic with Andriy Kravchuk, and he said that recently the Orthodox Church in Ukraine has been trying to avoid such meetings because at these meetings many support the same agenda what Russia does, and they don't want to give Ukrainians the feeling that they support Russian policy.
All these anti-gender movements are funded mainly by two forces: far-rightist conservatives from the USA and officially structures of Russian authorities. For example, they began to fund World Family Meetings. Such Congress was held in Verona 2 years ago, and that time our politicians went there, and church representatives proudly and openly reported about that. But this year, not a single church sent official delegations. There were some activists who represented themselves, but not their church.
However, this does not negate the fact that homophobic activism and rhetoric bring the Ukrainian church closer to the ultra-right activists, thus increasing the recognition and legitimacy of these groups. The Ukrainian ultra-right activists have tried to declare their contribution to the very establishment of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and to protection from the rival Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. The ultra-right homophobic groups were present near the religious leaders at mass events dedicated to the common agenda against LGBT people and for family. At such events, they say that feminists, together with LGBT people, are trying to destroy Christian and moral values of the Ukrainian people and challenge the Ukrainian traditional family. Andrei says.
They are now trying to establish connections with Ukrainian churches. They organize Orden, a hybrid organization, which on the one hand is far-right, and on the other is religiously conservative, and its leaders meet with Metropolitan Epiphanius. Well, this is a virtual organization. Like most of our far-right organizations, they exist mainly on paper. These are some individual leaders who put forward ideas and gather people around. There are extras who are mostly young people, often teenagers, about students, but they do not have any kind of consistent work. They attend some separate events, but the rest of the time they do nothing.
Many rejoiced at the fact that the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, independent from the Russian Orthodox Church, was established. One person was US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who on January 10, 2019 called it a historic achievement and called on the Ukrainian government and the church to develop tolerance and respect for religious freedom of supporters of all faiths. However, Pompeo's call to develop tolerance and respect remained unheard. Timur mentions.
Well, unfortunately, all churches in Ukraine are equally homophobic in general. I remember that when the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was created, there were expectations that this church was to some extent created in opposition to the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and that they should have had slightly different views. But if you look at the statements of, I think, Onufri, or what is the name of their leader, then he's essentially saying the same thing that the Russian Orthodox Church says.
Thus, during our interviews, Ukrainian activists repeatedly said that the Russian Orthodox Church still has a huge impact on the Ukrainian church and society. That's what Andrei says about it.
The Moscow Patriarchate feels freer in this regard. They are strongly against everything. The Moscow Patriarchate remains the last of the churches that regularly call to ban the March of Equality in Kiev. For the past 3 years, there have been no such direct calls from the other churches.
And Boris adds to this.
Because Russian state policy is openly homophobic and discriminatory, and this Russian state policy is usually transferred to the Russian church, which is retransmitted in Ukraine.
And Verhovsky explained in his interview how it is related.
Of course, it broadcasts in Ukraine, because in fact, half of Russian Orthodox Church is in Ukraine, if to see in numbers of parishes.
But what's the impact of the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia? Well, Russian state policy is related to the fact that the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church, ROC, constantly incites hatred towards LGBT people, and the significant growing influence of the ROC fuels homophobic sentiments. Here's Andrew with more.
We have
a very strong position of the Russian Orthodox Church. Let's say the ROC participates tries in every possible way to participate in the policy on family and state issues. There is a concept of family policy, which is actively promoted by the representative of the Russian Orthodox Church, and it denies the right of LGBT people to create a family, to be in same-sex marriages.
For representatives of the Russian Church in the state, the problem is that homosexuality is seen as a threat to Christianity and does not fit into the concept of Russian civilization. Here's Alexander Verkhovsky on this point.
Because this Russian civilization, whatever it means, is partly based on moral conservatism. It's part of the definition that we are, let's say, good meaning in the old, imagined old sense in the word, opposed to rotten West. So, of course, LGBT is the best example for conservatives. When in the church, initially the church started to talk about traditional values. Government took this idea much later, and I was one. It was interesting that for years, when church speakers had to say something concrete about traditional and non-traditional, they always took homosexuality as the only example, and just it looked like kind of obsession.
The church in Russia is very closely connected to the state and the politics they support, but there are also some peculiarities here, which Igor spoke to.
Again, let's put it that way. It is necessary to take into account historical features of Russia and features of relations between the church and the state. The church in Russia has always, since at least Peter I, so to speak, was a state institution. And accordingly, the political role of the church is very limited. That is, they are powerful insofar as they are supported by the state. Yes, so if the state needs the church to express some views, they will express them. And they, of course, will listen to them as well. According to public opinion polls, the authority of the church is quite high in Russia. Yes, that is, it's one of the authoritative public institutions. But at the same time, we have to understand that the church, at least now, is not, I would say that now they are not formulating an agenda for some public discussions. There are different points of views on this issue. Many people think they associate it with the fact that the patriarch is already old and in general not very active. And before that, he was younger and more active. I think that, now really, the hopes that the authorities had placed on the Orthodox Church in the early 2000s, they have not been met. The influence of the Church was not as great as expected. But at the same time, of course, the very idea of banning the propaganda of homosexuality and the idea of some kind of political restrictions for open LGBT people, it originated in the Orthodox Church. So, at least, to make such ideas public in the early 2000s, it was the Russian Orthodox Church that started to voice them. And then it became a political idea. It was picked up by, say, some politicians, etc. That is, then I would say that in the early 2000s, the political influence of the Russian Orthodox Church was stronger than it is now.
Verkhovsky also has a similar view. When talking about the connection between the state and the church, he emphasized that the Russian Orthodox Church hasn't become stronger. and in fact, it doesn't have such a huge impact on the society as it at first seems.
So the church is always mentioned as one of sources of moral authority, but it's just a gesture for average citizen. In fact, average citizen doesn't listen to patriarch says. Nobody cares. And the government uses the church for its agenda, of course, because if moral conservatism is important, and the church is, let's say, natural source.
We'd like to end this section of today's episode on a more positive note. Here's a personal story from one of our activists in Ukraine, Vladomir. His story shows that changes in the church can be seen on a more personal level when church officials meet LGBT individuals.
I recently lost a friend, a very good man, a professional in his field. Half of the city wept for him. He did not make coming out as gay. He did not talk about himself, but his surroundings knew his social identity. And, as it turned out, he died of AIDS. He lived with HIV for a very long time. He knew about his status, but unfortunately did not live long. And we had a common father. This is the priest of the Greek Catholic Church with whom we communicate. This father also constantly trolls me, saying, "Volodya, when will you change sides? Why are you doing that?" and so on. But in fact, he is quite tolerant of me and my partner, and he knows it all. And when he found out that the friend of ours had died of AIDS, he called me and said, "I'm very worried about you. You're also gay," and so on. I said, "Listen, it is not capillary. Something needs to be done to make this happen." I reassured him, saying that I have a long-time relationship, we do not betray each other, and still do tests periodically. And he calmed down. But so that you understand what a non-public church in Lviv really is. In fact, these are good people. If we take the father by analogy with the nationalists, if a priest is sincere, if he really serves his people, then he will not worry about gays. He will ask how things are. On the other hand, there's also, I call them a progressive part of the Greek Catholic Church. They are the priests who think on this topic and speak on this topic. There's a formula that I like because it represents the Catholic Church in general all over the world. This formula is as follows. We do not condemn homosexuals. We condemn homosexual behavior. That is, in fact, they do not say that you are devil's offspring. But if you do it there, so it is some kind of a sin. And it seems to me that this is a big step for the church. I think in 50 years we will see another big step. But yes, that is good.
As we've seen, the way in which Ukrainian and Russian LGBT organizations work to influence the public, civil society if you will, is dependent upon what resources and opportunities are available to them. As a Ukrainian activist, Tamir put it,
That is, that the issue of LGBT rights is the issue of resources. That is, roughly speaking, even our opponents, they have access to the TV almost around the clock. They can talk any nonsense there. LGBT people do not have this access, and accordingly, we lose purely in terms of resources.
And this holds true for Russia as well. In both countries, LGBT organizations must fight against narratives being written by the government and the church to try to get their message across to the public. However, in Ukraine, the influence of the EU allows for limited cooperation with the government, and in turn, the authority of the state validates LGBT work and messaging to the wider public. Lacking government support and working in an openly hostile LGBT environment, Russian activists must take the more arduous path of directly influencing civil society with direct action. A Ukrainian activist, Andrei, expressed optimism on this front. Not that civil society was becoming less homophobic, but that it was at least taking a more neutral stance on LGBT issues.
As I said, the attitude of Ukrainian society is gradually changing. Not that it becomes friendly, but more neutral. And I think this is a completely obvious process, and it greatly contributes to the integration of the LGBT community.
Our activists attributed these changes to influence of EU engagement, which necessitated a more LGBT-neutral stance on behalf of the government. Here's Boris with more.
In recent years, especially since the Revolution of Dignity, we have seen significant improvements because the focus of public policy has changed significantly. It is focused towards Europe. Plus, Ukraine has undertaken a fairly large number of obligations under the association with the European Union. That is, changing legislation in general, there are laws to combat discrimination.
But also, as Andrei explains, changes can be attributed to larger visibility of LGBT people in Ukraine due to pride parades and the trends in pop culture globally, which present a more positive image of LGBT people.
Ukrainian society largely is homophobic, but this homophobia is not active. We do not see active hostility or aggressive attitude, except from the far-right organizations. They are an exception. For the rest, society is indifferent, and we see that in recent years, the attitude has been gradually improving. Society is getting used to LGBT issues, and we associate this not only with our activities. I would say that this is connected to some permanent processes and to a formation of the pop culture influence. When people see it every day on TV and the internet, then they, in the end, begin to get used to it and stop paying attention. Certainly, such mass events as the Equality March also contributed to this a lot. They provoke discussions in society and social networks. Various points of view are expressed in these discussions, and we see that there are quite a lot of people who take this to heart and advocate a tolerant attitude towards the LGBT people, entering into discussions, and gradually the situation changes. It is difficult to underestimate the importance of social networks and internet influence, because the close familiarity of people helps to dispel stereotypes. I see that the people I spoke to 10 years ago, who are of religious kind, they were much more intolerant of the LGBT people, but during that time, they just got used to it. They realized that this is not something foreign, that issue of the LGBT people and the church also exist in the same way, and these problems concern them directly, and their rhetoric is gradually changing. I hope that it will change among our churches, because churches are still the main driving force of homophobia in Ukraine.
Vladimir points out this particularly influences young people who have exposure to other cultures.
People at age 35 and older are usually more wary of the LGBTI issues, more aggressive in social networks, and so on. They were brought up in a different commercial reality. They have social networks, they have the opportunity to travel. Unlike all of us at their age, it seems to me that young people are much more tolerant.
In Russian civil society, on the other hand, the government is actively campaigning against the rights of LGBT people. The propaganda law directly addresses LGBT organizations' ability to speak to the public and get their own narrative out about LGBT issues. It becomes illegal for individuals or organizations to speak favorably or even neutrally for the sake of education on LGBT issues. But this law also sparked a discussion on LGBT rights in Russia. Igor told us.
But basically, they voluntarily or not gave the platform to LGBT activists in order to speak out publicly. And in general, it was more likely that they lost that informational campaign. Yes, so it is clear that the level of homophobia in Russian society has increased. Of course, it is so. But at the same time, a significant part of civil society was on our side. That's when a big breakthrough happened. Yes, and above all, opposition politicians started to think that homophobia is bad, and that homophobia should be criticized, and the LGBT movement should be supported. Then, they began to think about it, and we started a dialogue with them. So, I think it's more like that. It's more like a victory for the LGBT movement.
On the other hand, increased visibility from the propaganda law, as well as things like pride marches, can create spikes in homophobia due to vocal resistance. Here's Verhovsky.
We have no measurements in that. It's up to sociologist organizations. Surely homophobia is high enough in our society, just because it is, society is rather conservative, and not in practice, but in ideas, let's say. So it's difficult to measure something because most people think about homosexuality if they do not have any personal reasons to think about their relatives or friends. But if something happens in this sphere, in public sphere, they start to react. It was very visible in I forgot which exact year when the gay pride in Moscow idea started to be discussed. It was 15, 13 years ago, I forgot. Immediately the rate of homophobic attitudes in the polls became higher. It's not that people became more homophobic, they just started, before they didn't think about it, mostly. Now they heard about that on TV and said, no, we don't want it, we don't like it, and so on. Before they just didn't care. And of course it takes time to, let's say, to be adopted to any new reality, including that. So the problem is that our authorities, especially starting from 2012, they use moral conservatism as part of their, let's say, tools for seeking for political support. It's a stable trend from beginning of 2012. It's related to public mass protests at that time. And they still use it. So I cannot say that massive homophobic attitudes in the society are created by the government. No, they are, let's say, natural, but they are supported by the government. Government does not let people forget it.
Tatiana advocated separating the homophobic attitudes of the government and civil society, suggesting that the homophobic laws the government passes doesn't necessarily reflect the attitude of the wider public.
You have to separate the people who are in power and the government representatives, well, for example, the police, court, some of the state institutions, because for people like ordinary people, people from the street, I don't think that the number of LGBT people in Russia or visibility is a serious problem. Accordingly, I don't think that homophobic moods are growing strongly. As a rule, for people in Russia, questions of their personal survival, growth of the well-being of their family, and not some questions, well, like say the morality of individual groups, come first. However, for the state, it's not like that. Moreover, it's quite clear that in the last 10 years, the state in Russia has become more and more homophobic. Laws are being adopted that discriminate against LGBT people, and the authorities feel such trends and follow them.
Tatiana points to the fact that LGBT organizations are still able to work in Russia, albeit informally, as a sign of at least toleration.
Well, we did not conduct such global polls, but I think that if in Moscow and the Moscow region people were categorically against the development of the activities of LGBT organizations, we would not be able to work. We are working for ourselves, there are no signs on the doors. Someone is tolerant of this, and someone doesn't know. Of course, the situation is not friendly for us, but on the other hand, we have no other choice. So we are working in the conditions that we have and are trying to change them a little.
However, Prohovsky points out that propaganda from the government cannot make a society homophobic and that a certain degree of homophobia must already be present.
Of course, if society, if we imagine the society which is not homophobic at all, no TV propaganda could make it homophobic. But if it is already somehow homophobic, the propaganda can, say, make these feelings stronger, give a material, and especially to remind again and again that there is a problem.
The relationship between civil society and LGBT people in Russia was best summed up by our activist Andrew. He said that those with direct links to the LGBT community, such as parents of LGBT youth and LGBT people themselves, will work to get educated on the issues the community faces and see past negative portrayals of the community. While for the rest of Russia, the LGBT community will remain something they don't entirely understand.
Thank you so much for listening. I've been Tanya.
And I've been Callie.
We wanted to give the activists the last word, so in these closing minutes, you'll hear quotes from our activists about their perspectives for the future and the LGBT community. First, you'll hear from our Russian activists and then our Ukrainian activists. Enjoy, and thank you again for being with us.
It seems to me that the Ukrainian scenario is very likely for Russia, and then all these xenophobic organizations, they will simply come to power as the right sector, and there will be a period when it will be necessary to try to agree with these cannibals. It's possible that for some time LGBT organizations in Russia will work underground. On the other hand, we have been watching for several years how events are developing in Ukraine, and in general, we managed to give them some degree of civilization. There, the hardcore organizations somehow go through the process of democratization, so maybe it will work out for us.
Я думаю, что изменения могут быть в разные стороны.
I think that changes can happen in different directions, in both, for the worse and for the better. I mean, it remains possible that, especially now, in such a critical time, the authorities will again try to use homophobia in order to unite such a conservative part of society and maybe to launch another attempt of homophobic campaign there. But I don't think that this campaign will enjoy such the success as it was in 2013. I mean, I think that if this trend of decreasing homophobic sentiments, which we are seeing now, continues, the situation will only improve for us. But there, we must understand that these are two different things, a real public opinion and the position of the state, because we have a big fog between these two trends. I think that the state homophobia may develop, or it may increase, but the level of public homophobia will decrease.
Безусловно, они будут восприниматься как...
LGBTQI-related organizations will increase their usefulness, even though they will remain a niche. They will still offer a helping hand for parents of LGBTQI people, for instance, or dealing with HIV-related issues, but they will reach out to a limited audience. They will probably not become something mainstream. They could, however, become stronger in the case that the current political elite in Russia loses grip on power.
Yes, I think in the nearest future it will be worse and worse. But when I think it will happen when Putin will die or he will be killed. We will see. We have a chance to change something. In Russia, many things depends of leader of country. It was many years like this, and we already had chance in 19. But we lose, and I think it will be, everything, this is a fact. This is our history, this is how society developing.
No one can resist an idea whose time has come. I think it's a question of LGBT people. This is a large social group in Ukraine, which remains in a discriminatory position, so it cannot last long, so it cannot last forever. Ukraine will definitely be a pro-European country. Ukraine will definitely ensure all the basic rights of LGBT people. The question is what it takes to work, and we work.
I am very afraid that the three crises in which Ukraine is now, the coronavirus, the economic crisis, and the war, may provoke society to find a scapegoat. And it is not just LGBTQI, it can be Roma, homeless people, people with mental disabilities. And that is why I'm really very afraid that with a clumsy government that cannot predict not even what will happen the day after tomorrow, but the next 2 hours of its activity, we will really promote ourselves. And this is our huge problem. Something like this may happen and some social conflict will break out. On the other hand, if we imagine that suddenly the government became conscious and began to respond to the challenges of today, if we are talking about the great prospect, then all has been well until 2019. Everything has been gradual, very slowly but gradually forward and upward. As an optimist, I will believe in this second scenario, but as a realist, I understand that the day after tomorrow, so to speak, I may become another victim of homophobia in Ukraine.
Якщо чесно, з Україною дуже складно. Тобто ми якось
To be honest, it is very difficult in connection with Ukraine. There were changes that no one expected, but they took place. For example, say marches of equality. Nobody knew it would happen. But Ukraine now essentially has one of the coolest marches of equality in the post-Soviet space. That is, we have jumped over a lot of countries, in fact. Well, that is, we need to abandon this inferiority complex. We are not as bad as we think. It seems to me that new voters are still growing up, no matter what. And young people, they're just different. The change of generations, it will still dictate their changes. Teenagers grow up with a completely different concept of values, a set of values, and these people will ask the question, why do we segregate people on the basis of some criteria? Why we decide who to give rights to and who not? And this will dictate their demands to political parties. Of course, it will take a lot of time, but I think it will happen anyway.
я думаю, що
I think that the LGBT organizations do not attract so much attention in Ukrainian society. For instance, with regards to the amendment to the labor code, which now also protects LGBT people from discriminatory dismissal, this was adopted only at the 7th round of voting. Did the public know? It seems like they did not. So I would argue that LGBT-related topics only make it to the news when it's something visible, like the parade marches. And yes, I'm talking about marches in plural, because more and more are being held and organized throughout Ukraine, like in Zaporizhia, in Odessa, in Kharkiv as well. And in Kharkiv, 7,000 people took part to the parade. I think it's a big result. And best of all, many youths are participating in it. Like they're burning with desire to take part in it. It's very nice because you can see that local communities already exist.